So where we are is with Kierkegaard. We're going to spend another day on Kierkegaard just to review. Uh, he speaks about three stages along life's way, and we talked about the first two are represented in his book Either or, which is probably his most famous book. And just to review, there's two guys talking. One of them is named A, and he represents the aesthetic stage in life, and the other guy is the judge who represents the ethical stage in life. And one way to think about them is the aesthetic stage considers freedom to be the absence of any restraints on his choices. So no marriage, no vocation, so he can do anything he wants anytime. And the judge corrects that, or in his view, corrects that interpretation of freedom and in saying that, well, you're free when you consciously create your future, when you make a choice and you make a commitment. Without that commitment, you can't really say you're free because you're just being batted around by whatever your desire is at the moment. And your desires are not really conscious things. You're just reacting, you're just responding to the external world and doing whatever turns you on. And the judge doesn't think that's really freedom because you haven't done it with passion and with commitment. And so in that respect, you're not really making a free choice. And that's what um, is going to define you. Up until the existentialists, everybody we've talked about is looking for the truth, even up to including Marx and Hegel. They're looking for what the real picture is, what the truth is of the our situation as human beings. That's what they're looking for. But with the advent of existentialism in the mid 19th century, what the guys are looking for is more like passionate commitment and choice. So instead of truth, they're looking for choice. And the reason is, in their minds, that choice precedes truth. In other words, you won't find a truth unless you're looking for that truth. Suppose you're looking for the meaning of life. Well, what would and that's typical for somebody studying philosophy, looking for the meaning of life. Well, what is your idea of what that would constitute? How would you know when you got there? This is kind of like going back to Meno's paradox. How would you know you found the meaning of life when you found it? And the existentialists are going to say, no, it isn't waiting for you out there. It hasn't already been established. There may be truths that are universal that you can know. They don't deny that. They're not like nutcases that deny the truths of science or something. But as far as your truth is concerned, and what is makes your life meaningful and truthful, that is preceded by your choices. And your choices will eventually lead to what your truth is. The statement that I've said before by Sartre is existence precedes essence. So your essence isn't waiting for you out there. It's something that you're determining by choice at every instant of your life. And then I recall the parable of the man captain of a ship who has to decide when to turn, but the entire time the ship is moving. There's not a time when the ship just stays there so they can figure out what to do. And this is Kierkegaard's parable for the situation you're in, the existential situation you're in as a human being. And there really isn't anybody who can tell you what to do because that, to restate what I've said before, as far as the existentialists are concerned, nobody has existed before or ever will exist again that is the same as you. You're in a completely uh, alone situation. And as Heidegger puts it, you're thrown into the world. And then you have to figure it out for yourself from that second onward. And then, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Anscombe says, well, yeah, we all know that. Let's get on with finding the truth. Basically, that's what she says. That's just, you're wet behind your ears if you're just figuring that out. Yes, that's the truth. However, it bears, I think it does bear um, reminding or examining what the existentialists are emphasizing. I don't think it's useless. I don't think it's just a vapid, empty saying. All right, so the first two stages are the aesthetic man and the ethical man, represented by A and the judge in either or. Now, what today we're going to talk about is uh, the religious stage. And the religious stage has two parts to it. And Kierkegaard calls it, you're the night of resignation, Knight, the night of resignation and the night of faith. He himself didn't consider himself somebody who made it all the way to being the knight of faith, although he was a knight of resignation. What is a knight of resignation? He realizes that no earthly pleasure will grant him peace and serenity. And even with the judge is emphasizing ethical choices that you should, the judge's ethics are more or less Kantian, like uh, act according to that maxim according to which you could recommend that everyone on earth acts according to. If you're acting according to a special rule just for you, or you're considering yourself an exception, then that's not moral. That's kind of the judge's essential ethical position. Well, even that, though, will not result in spiritual serenity or happiness or the grace of God. That won't happen either. That won't happen for the aesthetic man, and it won't happen for the ethical man. So, what this leads to, the end of the ethical stage, is what Kierkegaard calls the despair. He wrote a whole book on this called The Sickness Unto Death. I remember saying that they're like heavy metal songs. Fear and Trembling and Sickness Unto Death are not, they don't sound like bestsellers particularly. Maybe Fear and Trembling would be like a horror movie or something. But so he writes a whole book about despair in Sickness Unto Death. And that's the despair is a fear of spiritual emptiness. And the answer to that despair is faith. And Kierkegaard, interestingly, doesn't consider himself somebody who's made it all the way to faith. So then, in the book Fear and Trembling, what he does is describe what he thinks faith is, and it's quite a bit more uh, terrifying uh, than it's normally presented. So, what is faith? And his idea faith is exemplified in the story of Abraham and Isaac. So Abraham and Isaac, before I get to that, let me say that the Abraham and Isaac story was very important to Kierkegaard because of his relationship to Regina Olsen. You'll remember when he was 27 or so, he fell in love with Regina Olsen. They got engaged, and it was a passionate love affair. And at a certain point, like Kierkegaard decided he couldn't go that way. He couldn't become a married man and just live a conventional life. He couldn't do that. And you can read this as an extension of the aesthetic man. In other words, remember, the aesthetic man didn't want to commit to marriage because it would limit his other choices. You could read it that way. You can read into what his decision was any way you want. You can say, well, he just chickened out. You know, a lot of us, when you decide to get married, you get cold feet. Oh my God, I can't do this. You can say that's what he did. You can also say that he made the aesthetic man's choice of, I don't want to be committed to one person. I want to be free. You could say that, but that's not, neither of those is what he said. And it's interesting what he said. Now I'm going to read you a I'd be interested. Let's see. I think I'm afraid that Anne is the only one here that's representing the fairer sex. No, no, we got Laurel. Laurel showed up, and we don't have
Well, I showed
Meredith.
up, but I may disappear intermittently. There was apparently a skunk in the backyard at some point. The dogs, the two
Oh,
dogs.
what?
I don't think they were sprayed directly, but they are not happy campers
Well,
about
you
the family and
that's
everything.
an original excuse, Laurel. I haven't heard that one before. That's pretty good.
Well,
Um,
no, we had one who actually got skunked a few years ago, so I know they're around. But anyway, so I'm
you don't
trying.
want that. You don't want the dog smelling like skunk.
No,
Uh,
well, they're locked in another room, but they're not happy with me. I'm not happy.
okay, well,
I don't think they were really hit, but they apparently found a place where it had been and investigated a little too closely. So, uh,
all right. Well, uh,
so
back to
I'm sorry.
Kierkegaard.
So what am I? What am I representing?
Well, here's what it
Female?
is. I'm going to read to you a passage from Kierkegaard's journals, and I want your what you think your response would be. I already did this for to Teresa and asked her if you were, say, Regina's age, you're like 18 or 19, and this guy writes this to you. Now, he didn't really write this to her, but it's written addressed to her in the journals, like he's writing his innermost thoughts as if he were writing to you. And I'm going to read them, and I'd like to see what your interpretation or your response to this kind of thing is. Okay, here he goes. You, sovereign queen of my heart, hidden in the deepest secrecy of my breast, in the fullness of my life idea, there where it is just as far from to heaven as it is to hell. Unknown divinity. Can I really believe the poets when they say that the first time one sees the beloved object, he thinks he has seen her long before, that love, like all knowledge, is recollection. This is Plato, by the way. He was quite familiar with Plato. That love in the single individual also has its prophecies, its types, its myths, its Old Testament. Everywhere in the face of every girl, I see features of your beauty. But I think I would have to possess the beauty of all the girls in the world to extract your beauty. I will throw everything away in order to become light enough to follow you. Now, suppose you had gotten this letter from a boy, what would you think?
I would be very impressed.
Oh, you
I
would.
At
would
19?
think the guy was an English major.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I don't know. It seems I, I would have thought it was I would have thought that I would have been surprised if someone had written something like that to me. It just said I would have thought, what the
Yeah,
much
Teresa,
true.
I've run this by two women so far. And Teresa, my wife, and then another old friend who I think I mentioned before, who was a professor for years at San Francisco State, professor of English composition. And they both were, Teresa said, I don't like the part where he compares my face to everybody else's. My face should be the only one he ever thinks about and thinks is real.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing. And Elizabeth, the professor, said, I'd be running for the exits. This is insane. This is just way too over the top and way too intense. And I could
Well, I
never,
do think it's pretty crazy. I
what's
do think it's
that?
crazy. I think it's pretty crazy. But, there were a couple of crazy guys that I was pretty smitten with in my adolescence. Like, I mean, certifiably crazy. Okay. So I'm just being truthful.
No, that's what we want. Uh,
Yeah, I think I don't. Someone a long time ago gave one description of me, a somewhat um, colorful, overdone, and I thought, yeah, right. Um, on the other hand, he was a colorful person, and I suppose it fit. But um, but no, I would have. Yeah, I don't know that I would have been running for the exits, but I would have sort of said, "Ha, right, yeah."
Well, anyway, this is Kierkegaard talking, and this is the kind of passion that Kierkegaard had for Regina. And um, oh, a little note from Laurel about dealing with skunks. The okay, the thing is that he broke off the relationship, and the reason he broke it off. Now, let me read a little further here. This isn't actually further exactly, but another passage that starts to explain uh, why he breaks it off. This terrible restlessness, as if wanting to convince myself every moment that it would still be possible to return to her. Oh God, would that I dared to do it. It is so hard. My last hope in life I had placed in her, and I must deprive myself of it. How strange. I had never really thought of getting married, but I never believed that it would turn out this way and leave so deep a wound. I've always ridiculed those who talked about the power of women, and I still do, but a young, beautiful, soulful girl who loves with all her mind and all her heart, who is completely devoted, who pleads uh, how often I've been close to setting her love on fire, not to a sinful love, but I need merely to have said to her that I loved her, and everything would have been set in motion and to end my young life. To end my young life is kind of a weird way to put it. Okay, I'm not going to continue, but what what he says that he's doing to himself, how he explains it, is that I think there are two elements to what he says. One is that he wrote a book called Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. And this one thing is devotion to God. So he feels like Augustine that any kind of earthly love is going to direct his mind away from God, which is the way it should be directed. I think he feels that passionately. At the same time, he feels that he doesn't want to subject Regina to his kind of uh, focus on the eternal and focus on God. He sees it, I believe, as a choice between the eternal and the temporal, the religious and the secular. And to marry her and really be devoted as a husband is to accept the secular life. And I don't think I've ever had to make such a choice. It never would have bothered me, you know. I mean, I'm living now and I'm going to live now. But for Kierkegaard, it was a big deal. And it defined the rest of his life, really, in many ways. And then he compares himself to the sacrifice Abraham makes. And this is what he writes about in Fear and Trembling. So that's what I want to talk about now. I mean, he consciously, let me see if I can find that quote. He consciously says that um, what Abraham found easiest, I found the hardest. He was permitted to lift the knife. At the last moment, he was stopped. But I had to renounce her without any such outward event. He got his Isaac back. I didn't. So this is not my interpretation. It's his own interpretation of sacrificing his love for Regina in order to pursue spiritual purity. This is his interpretation. So since the whole book of Fear and Trembling is his, it's one of his many, but it's the main description of what he believes Christian faith to be. I'm going to spend some time on that. And it's the story of Abraham and Isaac. And uh, first, I'm going to read the actual story from Genesis, or a little, bits of it anyway. And then I'm going to talk about how he interprets this story, which is very. I mean, I don't know how many of you went to Sunday school or synagogue, uh, but Abraham is not a minor not a minor character. He's the father of three religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and all of them trace their origin back to Abraham. And so this isn't a bit player in the Bible. He's a central figure in three religions and a founding figure, right? And so he is the representation for all these three religions of what true faith really is, right? So Terry Kierkegaard takes this seriously and it says, okay, let's look at this guy. And I have, a few years ago, I saw on television some PBS thing. It was a bunch of theologians talking about uh, I don't know if they were all theologians. I actually not now that I think about it, I doubt it. But they were religious, somehow religious thinkers, right? And they were discussing the Abraham and Isaac story. And it was evident to me that none of them had read Fear and Trembling. Oh my God, I don't see how they could possibly be discussing the Abraham and Isaac story without considering Kierkegaard's interpretation of it. But anyway, so let me start here by uh, kind of reciting a bit of Genesis 22. Uh, so Abraham, one night, um, God speaks to him and he says, take now thy son, thine only son. I know you guys know this story, but it's it's relevant to actually consider the text in the Bible. Now take thy son, thy only son Isaac. Well, by the way, at this time in his life, Abraham was 100 years old. And Sarah had finally gotten pregnant. She's 90 years old. This is a little bit of a stretch from the get-go, but nevertheless, they haven't been able to have a child. And Abraham is the head of the tribe of Israel. So he is somebody who hopes to have some offspring who would take up that mantle. And they haven't had a child at all. Well, so Sarah, this is just so kinky. I mean, Sarah permits him to sleep with Hagar, and Hagar becomes pregnant with a boy called Ishmael. Now, Hagar is a slave, so we don't really think it's that cool. This is like Thomas Jefferson. We don't think it's that cool for a master to sleep with a slave and get her pregnant, but according to the Bible, it's okay because Abraham did it and Sarah was okay with it. Oh my God. This is not what we think is okay in the 2025. So anyway, but that's what happened. So anyway, they've already had this son, Hagar has already had this son, Ishmael, and still they have no actual son of their own. So finally, at the age of 100, God, that the way they think about it, God has finally given them a son, Isaac, right? So now, okay, let me continue with the story. Uh, God says, "Take thy son, thy only son, thine only son." So he's not counting Ishmael, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took two of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went to the place of which God had told him. Now, notice he doesn't discuss anything with Sarah. Wouldn't you think, Sarah, last night I had a vision from God, and he said I should go sacrifice my son on an altar, burnt offering to God. Don't you think you'd want to talk that over a bit with your wife? Oh my God. But no, it's not even brought up as something that he would do. No, he just, starts to get all the stuff together. Um, eh, so then when he gets up there, he, uh, oh, Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, my father, he said, here I am, here am I, my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they both went off together, and they came to the place where God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Uh, and and God said, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. All right. So this is always taught in Sunday school as look how faithful he is. He's so willing to abide by God's word that he's going to sacrifice the most important thing to himself in life, and that is Isaac. And we're supposed to think, wow, that is so impressive. I could never I could sacrifice, my even sacrificing my dog would be a step too far, I think. Maybe I'd sacrifice, I'll give him some money in the offering plate. Will that do? But no, here's a guy who's willing to kill his son. And this is I'm not making this point. This is the point Kierkegaard makes. Uh, Wait a minute. That is just insane. It's not uh okay. His phrase for it, Kierkegaard's phrase, is the teleological suspension of the ethical. And you'll remember the word teleological from our ethics discussions. Teleology is the study of the results. In other words, when we're doing ethics, we if we consider the results as opposed to the principle involved, then we're considering the teleology of the ethics. So John Stuart Mill is the one we discussed who considers what are you trying to accomplish here? And Kierkegaard calls Abraham's act a teleological suspension of the ethical because if Abraham had, in real life, if he had actually done this and gone back to his tribe and gone back to his wife and told them, well, God told me to do this, what would they think? There's no possible way that either Sarah or any of the rest of his tribe would say, "Oh, right on, Abraham. You did the right thing. You." No, they'd think you're out of your mind. You're crazy. That was a horrible thing to kill your son. Nobody would have thought other than that. And Abraham knows this. So imagine if you were in imagine if you were sitting in church and the minister gave a sermon on this story, and so you went home and killed your own son. What would you tell to the police? Well, God told me to do this. So it's not going to, the outcome of this can't be good in any way for Abraham. There's no way that it creates any goodness in the world for him to kill his son. It won't advance him, and it won't advance his family, and it certainly won't advance Isaac. And so Kierkegaard compares Abraham's actions to those of Agamemnon. Now, you remember Agamemnon, or maybe we didn't talk about this, but in the beginning of the Trojan War, uh, Agamemnon gathers the tribes together. Um, I think it's in Euboea, and he they are all set to sail, but they can't get a decent wind to sail. They're waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally the priest of Artemis, I believe, comes and talks to him and says, "You need to make a sacrifice." So Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia to the god Artemis, and the winds turn around, and he gets wind to sail to Troy. So Kierkegaard compares Abraham to this, and he said, "Well." Uh, there was no, in Abraham's case, there was no outcome that he expected to be good from it. In other words, Abraham got a deal. He's okay, well, it's a pretty serious sacrifice, but you're going to get your wind to sail to Troy. Abraham wasn't promised anything. There's no quid pro quo. God doesn't say, if you do this, I will, make you be fruitful and multiply. He doesn't ever say that. There is a teleological suspension of the ethical in the sense that he is just going to obey God. He is just going to obey God with no foresight and no promise of anything to follow. And Kierkegaard says, Kierkegaard, his conclusion is, which he says several times during Fear and Trembling, this is faith. And if it is not faith, there is no such thing as faith. Now, that's a pretty severe definition of faith, that you are willing to sacrifice for no reason, for no earthly reason whatsoever. It's not like, okay, and then be elected to the you'll get to be a minister, you'll get to do anything. No, there's nothing. Uh, and it's an absolute faith that God is going to direct you in the right way. And so it's basically psycho. It's psychotic. There's absolutely no human justification for your actions other than your faith. Yeah, Peter.
It's even more extreme than that because God has made a promise to him, and the promise is of a numerous posterity, and in thee shall all families of the earth.
Ooh, you got frozen again.
All
It's frustrating.
the
You're
promise. God argues he believes the promise will be fulfilled, but he also ready.
this is very
By
frustrating. We're
reasoning.
not we're not hearing you, Peter.
I'm sorry, I had a feeling maybe you weren't.
Uh,
So let's see if Ann can fix it, but it's okay if you can't.
Can you
no,
hear him
we
now? Can you hear me?
I want to hear yeah, I heard you. Uh,
Okay, well, what you're saying, Peter, lean over this way.
Okay, I'll lean over. Um, in a way, it's even worse than that there's no reason to sacrifice Isaac because God has promised Abraham he'll have a numerous posterity, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. And the only legitimate child he has is Isaac. So if he kills Isaac, it certainly looks in every rational and empirical way as if he is destroying the possibility that the promise would be fulfilled. And Kierkegaard says, but he believes the promise will be fulfilled at the same time that he believes he has the duty to sacrifice Isaac. And that's absurd, but he believes by virtue of the absurd, that you can't get much farther than that, but that's what he finally says.
the right, the difference that I think Kierkegaard's making between Abraham and Agamemnon is that Agamemnon actually carries out the sacrifice and gets his reward. Whereas, as you say, the absurd thing is that Abraham gets the reward, but he doesn't carry out the sacrifice. Whereas Kierkegaard, remember, this is all reflected in Kierkegaard's own self understanding that he has sacrificed Regina, and with the faith somehow that it will all be returned to him, but it never is. And he's aware of this, that it isn't, it, he doesn't get Regina back, nor does he get anything to replace her, basically. So the religious stage in Kierkegaard is separates it into two stages. One is the night of resignation, and the other is the night of faith. And the night of resignation I just mentioned is the idea that you um, know that nothing on earth will satisfy your religious longing and quest. You know that, and you're resigned to it. That's why you are the night of resignation. However, the night of faith, somehow the night of faith gets, I'm not sure what he gets, but his faith allows him to have his life returned to him somehow, all the goodness returned to him. It's not clear that to me that Kierkegaard thought that Regina would actually come back or anything like that. In Abraham's case, of course, he does become the father of the tribe of Israel, but it's not clear to me that either in Agamemnon's case uh, or I mean, excuse me, that Kierkegaard's case reflects either Agamemnon or Abraham. He doesn't get anything back, and he's conscious of that. That his sacrifice is worse than Abraham. Well, it's not worse than Abraham because he doesn't sacrifice anything, whereas Kierkegaard does. But unlike Agamemnon, he doesn't get anything for his sacrifice. That's the state that Kierkegaard finds himself in. Yeah. Yeah, Peter.
Um, he seems to have believed until July 1843 that there was some possibility that he would get back together with Regina, but he found out then that she was engaged and she
Yeah.
got married. And the question is, had he written the whole of Fear and Trembling before he found that out? And I think Walter Lowry argues he probably had, that the book was finished, and the connection between Regina and Isaac was cryptic enough that he felt like he could publish it without giving anything away publicly. But he had lost the hope that animated the book.
Uh, right. But he does admit that he himself doesn't make it to the stage of the Night of Faith.
Well, pseudonym admits it. I think you're right in assuming that Kierkegaard is a lot like Johannes de Silentio, but like some commentators will say, oh, Johannes de Silentio has not got to that point, but Kierkegaard has. I think he's completely shelving the question whether he has and simply saying his pseudonym hasn't, this imaginary character.
Right. That's an interesting uh, distinction to make.
Yeah, I don't make the distinction that much. I think, Johannes de Silentio is a mask behind which you can see Kierkegaard's face pretty clearly. But I'm not sure he wanted it to be like that.
It's a little hard to tell because he's that pesky pseudonym stuff that he does
Mhm. Yeah.
makes it a little difficult. Okay, so that is sorry. Er, that is our description of the third phase of the third stage along life's way. The aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And religious has the two stages, uh, the night of resignation and the night of faith. And this is all represented in Abraham. I pretty much think that this is not the average minister's take on the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Bible. It's quite extreme. And like I said, when I heard all those religious figures talking about it, just ignoring this, it's like a child's. If you read it like they do in Sunday school, it's as Kierkegaard said, it's no big deal. Kierkegaard makes the distinction between these three stages and he says often religion is paraded as occupying one of the stages before the religious stage. In other words, there is an aesthetic appreciation of Christianity, which is the story of Jesus. Here's this pure-hearted guy who is sacrificed unjustly and caused to die. There's a lot of drama, the Passion of Christ. Movies have been made about this and how it is a very dramatic story. But if all it was a dramatic story, you might as well leave it in the hands of Hollywood directors. It's not just an aesthetic pleasure to read or drama to read the Bible. And secondly, it's also not identified as ethical. You could be an ethical person and be a Kantian without being religious. So I think Kierkegaard makes a pretty strong point that if you really want to take the Bible seriously, you have to take the story of Abraham and Isaac seriously. If you want to have the faith that is presented by Jesus and by Abraham, then you can't think of it as a nice story and you can't think of it as just how to behave ethically in life because both of those could be done completely without any religious faith of the sort that Kierkegaard is describing. And so this is faith. If there is any such thing as faith, it's this. I don't know. I'm personally not willing to go there. Like I say, I have a hard time thinking. Now, Robert Johnson, I guess, if you make a Faustian deal with the devil, maybe you're making that kind of a gamble. I don't know, but anyway, uh, so thoughts on this kind of radical presentation by Søren Kierkegaard?
Other people changed the tone.
You just let Barry.
Well, I was just, I mean, I was just thinking about the book of Job, and it seems interesting that, the Old Testament God seemed to want to subject people to tests of their degree of faith, which seemed like another example of that.
Right, and the whole covenant that God has with the people of Israel is a test of their faith, and they're continually tested. Um, it's an interesting dynamic, religious dynamic, and it's not one that is often preached from. Well, I guess it is. It depends on who you have as a minister, but it's the fire and brimstone part of Christianity or religion. Yeah, Laurel.
So Kierkegaard's feeling that sacrifice is important, that one has to do this, seems to me to belong in a little bit to the Catholic. Does he? I mean, doesn't he just want to be a priest or something? Is he? Augustine sort of saying you that women are a distraction from the life of religious serious religiousness. I mean, maybe he has a vocation that he can't fulfill in some way. This is it. I guess the other thing that strikes me about this is that it's a very masculine or man oriented way of thinking about it. Where's the place of women in all of this? Hello, you can man and give up marriage, and women don't seem to have this conversation leaves women and their possible role or seriousness about purpose and existence kind of out of it.
You know, that is an excellent point, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody make it before. It's an absolutely bang on point that it just excludes women. Well, so does Augustine. I mean, women, so does St. Paul. Women are considered uh, kind of degrading. Like your relationship with a woman is degrading. Like Paul thought that the more perfect life was a singular life, a solo life. So did Augustine, and obviously so does Kierkegaard. So it's not he's not standing outside the Christian tradition when he's saying all these things.
No,
In his view, and the view of a lot of theologians, he's purifying. He's making the central point, the condensed point of Christianity. Yeah, Peter.
women are outside of
What's that?
women are outside of it. We don't have souls, or we can't be religious, or I don't know.
We don't have.
I find it irritating, especially that nation that the previous quote from him.
If you take the Abraham story all by itself, just Genesis 22, it seems women don't count. But if you put it together with the way Sarah appears in Genesis, that she has the initiative to have Abraham beget Ishmael. She has the initiative to drive out Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness where she expects them to be killed. And when she's told she's going to have a child at the age of 90, she laughs, and Isaac supposedly means laughter. So she really does have a role. And from time to time in the Old Testament, admittedly, very few times, God speaks to a woman in some way or other and tells her what to do. Like Deborah is told to be a prophet in the same, or a judge in the same way that Gideon and the other male judges are. And Rebecca may not be directly told by God, but God wants her to do what she does, which is switch Jacob and Esau so that Jacob becomes the child of the promise. I mean, that's not ethical either, but that's what she does. So if you take the Old Testament all together, I think women are very active in it. If you take the Jewish tradition at the time of St. Paul, then I think you can criticize it in pretty much the same way as you can criticize the Christian tradition. That is, Rabbinic Judaism in many ways represents a narrowing from the Old Testament, which is something Nietzsche believed and I believe.
Uh, uh, you can have a female rabbi though, and you
And well, a female Reform rabbi. I
a
don't know if the
reformed rabbi,
Orthodox
and
accepted it.
you still can't have a Catholic priest that is
You
female.
can. Apropos of what Laurel said about, that there's something Catholic about Kierkegaard, there is that beautiful passage about the Virgin Mary in Fear and Trembling, that her situation is in some ways almost as bad as Abraham's, in that nobody knows but her that the angel spoke to her and told her about this child she would conceive. So she's in a position of shame besides the usual distress and dread of childbirth. And he pays a great tribute to the Virgin Mary. And Walter Lowry says in a note, this is kind of unusual for a Protestant. Um, but you can't put it on Lutheranism because Luther thought getting married was like a holy act for him. In many ways, he was really close to Catholic theology, though he was a rebel, but he wasn't on the subject of marriage and celibacy. It's Kierkegaard's own,
Weirdness.
peculiar idiosyncrasy.
I think we could agree he's pretty idiosyncratic. Uh, Old Kierkegaard. Oh my goodness. All right. Any more stuff on Kierkegaard? More reactions? More discussion? My advisor at Yale was Paul Homer. He was a Kierkegaard scholar and a really good man. And he's the one that told me I was throwing my life away when I decided to go off and play music. Um, But I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that anything is throwing your life away because, as the judge says, it doesn't matter what you choose, you're still always able to choose the next second. Nothing is written in stone. And this is the definition of existentialism, that existence precedes essence, uh, contradicts Marx and Freud, because Marx and Freud and Sartre becomes a Marxist. I don't think I've read all the stuff as his explanation of how he can be a Marxist. But a Marxist is a determinist, and a Freudian is a determinist in the sense that they believe that who you are now is determined by other forces that don't have any present input. Like Marx believes that it's because of your social state, and Freud believes that it's because of your state as an infant, and those dictate who you are now. And existentialism denies that there's ever such a state that dictates who you are now, that right now you can make a choice to be somebody other than who you are. So I'm not sure how you there. And then there's Eric Fromm, who's an existential psychoanalyst. Another difficult problem. Excuse me, Sartre does criticize uh, Freudianism for exactly this, that no, it's not true that at any point you're not free to do whatever you want. He wants to make a big point of that. Uh, but the existentialists, just I'm talking about as a whole now, as a group, they deny determinism. And so, yeah, Peter's going to explain to me how Sartre could be a Marxist and an
No,
existentialist.
no, I think Sartre way exaggerates what human freedom is. And I think different as they are from each other, Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard all have some very strong sense, if not always of determinism, of fate, of, men make their own history, but they do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves. I think Sartre is too self-enclosed as a Parisian intellectual and kind of forgets that even when he takes some good political positions as a Marxist or writes good books. We're not as free as he claims.
Well, another way to look at this, and by the way, this is why, well, I believe the reaction to all the things we're discussing right now is why we have something in the 20th century called the Vienna Circle and logical positivism. But we'll get to that. Anyway, um, another interpretation would be Nietzsche's, that you can accept any system of thought as an experiment. Remember, you're going to live as an experiment. Your life is an experiment. So you can try them on like a set of clothes. You can say, well, do I look good in this suit? And you can try on existentialism, or you can try on Marxism, or you can try on Freudianism and live as a Marxist, or live as an existentialist, or live as a Freudian or a Republican, whatever. You could try on those clothes as an experiment, and that's the way that you grow. But the moment well, I guess there's a contradiction there. If you are really going to try on the clothes, then you have to accept it wholeheartedly. But the idea with uh, Nietzsche is definitely that no system could possibly encompass all of reality. It's just flat out impossible, or even a very small part of reality. So that if you really wed yourself to one interpretation of everything that's going on, you eliminate all the other infinite possibilities of what is going on. What other narrative has relevance to you? So you could look at it that way, that you could try on Marxist as an experiment. And so in that way, I can kind of see what Sartre was up to. Does anybody, from Ann to everyone, you are hysterical. I'm not sure how to take that. Uh,
Hey, Doug.
oh, to Doug.
Oh,
Oh, it
okay.
was to Doug. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Uh, what did he say? I missed it.
Well, you got to look at the comments.
Yeah, okay. The. Yeah, well, that's Bob Dylan.
No, no, keep going. Keep
Oh,
going.
yeah, this philosophy make my ass look big. Um, that is a paraphrase of something somebody said about Trump.
Tony, was Kierkegaard actually, how did he feel about organized religion?
Oh, well, he was pretty critical of it. He thought that yeah, it was like very similar to Nietzsche's criticism. It was just an enforcement of middle class bourgeois values. It wasn't the church as it existed wasn't really, as Nietzsche would say, it wasn't really godlike. There was nothing godlike that was being practiced in the church. I think he was very critical of the church, and I don't think this was heavily endorsed by the church of his day. I think it was held in bad odor by the church. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, he denounced the church of his day to the point where, according to Robert Coles, it became kind of proverbial in Denmark, don't be a Søren, don't be like him. But I think he kind of thought it was between the individual and God. And he does say at one point in Fear and Trembling, the church is not really that different from the state. It's an organized group of people. But I'm not talking about your relation mediated by the church. I'm talking about an unmediated relation to God. Of course, one answer to that is how would you know about God if it weren't for the church or the temple or the synagogue or the mosque or wherever? And you can't be that, isolated from it. But he was really very isolated.
Yeah,
Think,
and his phrase for that was your relationship to God is the absolute relationship to the absolute, which means that you are an absolutely uh, individual human being, and your only absolute relation that you could have could not be to anybody in this world. It can only be to God. And so this is basically the extreme version of Protestantism, because the whole idea behind Protestantism is that your faith shouldn't be mediated by a body, by the Pope and the Catholic doctrine and the Catholic structure of the Catholic Church. It shouldn't be mediated. You should have a direct relationship to God, and that was made possible, or more possible, by the printing press. And then, as Peter says, the even the printing press is you're reading something. That's where you get your idea of God, is from this text. So it isn't out of the ether that you get your idea of what God is. You get it out of a book, even if you're not going to church and having it interpreted by a minister or anything. If you get it out of a book, it's still something that isn't is mediated in that sense. I I may have mentioned before that if somebody asked me if I believe in God, I ask them what they mean by God, and that's impossible to answer. Wittgenstein has a little uh, simile he uses for this, or metaphor, which is that God is like a box that everybody carries around with them, but nobody has ever looked inside it.
Hmm.
It refers to this. It's like this word that everybody uses without having any universal understanding of. There isn't any universal understanding of what it means, whereas there is a universal understanding of what a lot of things mean. Like Beyonce, we know what that means, but if I say God, we're not really sure what that means, and yet everybody's, very in favor or against it. Anne.
So, Tony, I have a question. The more you're talking about Kierkegaard, the more it's reminding me of Ingmar Bergman. You know if he was influenced by Kierkegaard, his
Ingmar
films?
Bergman. I can't answer that. I mean, I don't know
Uh-huh.
why it seems
Hmm.
Bergman seems very Kierkegaardian, but I've never thought about that before.
Well, it's just reminding me so much of some of Bergman's films, this search for God and this loneliness and this like coming to the edge of something and not being able to cross over, and the anguish and so on. I used to watch a lot of Bergman films and I really like him, but it's just is really making me think of him.
And
Well,
Strindberg too. He's like that. Ibsen isn't, but Strindberg is.
well, I never had considered that before, Anne, but it's an excellent point.
Mm.
Uh, you're right. He does seem that way. He has that brooding, uh, kind of metaphysical presentation of his stories.
Mhm. I mean, like the Seventh Seal,
Seventh Seal, yeah.
yeah, or Winter Light, some of those agonized movies.
Virgin
Hmm.
Spring also
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
very much. Yeah, that when I saw the Virgin Spring, it really blew me away. It was the first Bergman film I ever saw, and I thought it was really, really powerful.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful.
But it's like the two narrative lines of the Seventh Seal are almost, in the one, the guy gets married, they have a baby, they live that kind of life. And in the other one, it's the lonely knight, who's been to the Crusades and eventually just, oh, okay, there's my physical therapy person. I have to say goodbye. But
Oh, okay.
Peter, oh,
Well, we'll see you next time, man. We'll
yeah,
start talking about the 20th
they
century.
like good. Yeah, great. Well, Peter's not disappearing. He's coming back in a minute.
Okay.
See you guys. Take
All
care.
right. Bye-bye, Anne. She seems to be
I
doing better.
Yeah.
good. Hey, Peter.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I I feel like Kierkegaard has kind of backed himself in a corner, right? I mean, we have, if you go through that whole chronology we've been talking about the tests, it seems almost transactional when Abraham is like, well, I'm completely determined. I don't have any free will, right? So we only see that side of Abraham. You see that Kierkegaard is sort of saying, well, I'm going to give up this because I'm on this other quest, but then doesn't, and it's not clear it takes him anywhere. You can't get out of despair, right? You can't get to faith. Am I, it's kind of interesting to see him in the light of not as much free will as maybe he thinks he's got.
Why don't you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I'm trying to follow his arc, right? He's entranced by this woman, and that's part of the aesthetic and maybe the ethical, but at some point he's trying to set those aside because he wants to move on to this, this thing. It's sort of like it's over here, kind of like, and in that way, when you think about Abraham's sort of saying, well, I'm going over here, forget all the rest of that stuff. Forget about Isaac, forget about Sarah, forget about, I've been promised I'm not even sure what I've been promised, but I'm over here, I'm divorced from the world in that decision, right? I'm clearly not. Um, and I don't know, did Kierkegaard end up in the same place? He's divorced from the world, but he's not sure I'm not sure where he gets to the end. I don't know if I'm seeing this right.
Well, I think you're consistent with what he thought about himself. He also says that he is divorced from the world. In other words, the night of resignation he identifies with, but he doesn't feel like he's gotten his reward and become the knight of faith. The knight of faith is living in joy because he has uh, committed himself to God and has, like I say, the absolute relationship to the absolute. And that has taken the place of all the things that he aspired to previously. But now he's sacrificed Regina and he doesn't get his reward. That's the way he describes it. Peter, yeah.
Just to get back to Abraham for a second, Kierkegaard says that if, when he took Isaac with him to sacrifice, he had not loved Isaac, or he had even loved Isaac less, or were, relatively indifferent to Isaac, the whole paradox would lose its meaning.
That's right.
He had to love him as much as he ever loved him and still be ready at God's command to plunge the knife in him.
Also,
And that is why he says it by reason of the absurd. Yeah,
Peter,
go ahead.
along the same lines, you can't, sometimes you hear people interpret this story as being Abraham had faith that God wouldn't really ask him this. But
I
that
know.
again, that just destroys the paradox. He has to fully believe that he's going to have to kill Isaac. He has to believe that, or else it isn't a story of faith. It's a story of wink, wink. I'm not going to really make you do this. So don't worry about it. Just go up and go through the charade, and I'll save you. If that is the story, and Kierkegaard makes this plain, if that's the story, it's not a story about faith anymore. So that you have to be willing to do this really radical, horrible thing in order to it's not to prove uh
To
it's
do God's will.
it's that leap. If you're willing to do that because God told you to, then you have achieved the level of faith that Kierkegaard is aspiring to. And he doesn't claim that he has ever reached that state. It's some crazy stuff, but I think it's fair. I mean, I think all of Kierkegaard's interpretations of this story are fair. I think they're fairly put to the Christian or Judaic or Islamic traditions. I think those are fairly put, and rather than the Sunday school version that we all get, like, oh, you were willing to sacrifice your, pet hamster. Uh, that's not really what's going on here. And the wink isn't going on either. There's no God tipping his hat to, tipping his cards to Abraham and showing him that it's not really going to happen.
So,
There's no,
so Tony, is it to what Neil's saying? Is Kierkegaard sort of a transitional figure in the sense that he's certainly, a part of the existential line of thought, but he's not gone fully to the point of realizing that God is not necessary. Uh, he's still looking for that spiritual explanation of everything, and he wants to renounce, the material world to get there. But it seems like the later existentialists aren't, they're not searching for a spiritual explanation of everything.
I'm not sure that's quite true. Heidegger, I believe, is kind of looking for that. The Heidegger and Kierkegaard want a life that is authentic. Authenticity is a big deal with Heidegger, and that's kind of a. If we go back to Hegel, that's kind of a uh, the final movement in the dialectic that you're separated. And Kierkegaard was a student of Hegel too, and so he knew that one step in the dialectic, perhaps, was when he became the knight of resignation and stepped away from the world. But the next step in the dialectic should be a reunification with God, which he felt never happened. Whereas with Heidegger, I think he holds out the idea that you can live authentically. I mentioned that I wrote a paper in graduate school where I compared Heidegger to Christian theology and showed the parallels. Peter.
Yeah, Heidegger is, I think, I agree with what you said about him, but he's also an avowed atheist. But many 20th century existentialists are, closely and positively connected to some kind of organized religion, like Karl Jaspers with Protestantism, Gabriel Marcel with Catholicism, Martin Buber with Judaism. Their relation may be different. Like Buber said, I am the Lord your God is revelation, all the rest is human interpretation. And that is kind of a radical break with the Orthodox Jewish tradition, but it's still Jewish. So the two strands seem to develop in parallel to each other and in opposition to each other, atheistic existentialism and religious existentialism. And, nobody has succeeded in, like reconciling them through a middle term that I know of.
And then there's Paul Tillich too. But
Yeah, sure.
um, yeah, I think you said, did you say they kind of run in parallel? Did you
Yeah,
say that?
and
Yeah.
they're going in similar directions as far as existentialism goes, way as far as reveal religion or whatever you want to call it goes.
Yeah, well, this is a good segue, I think, into the next thing we're going to address, and that is uh, the Vienna Circle and logical positivism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm mainly going to go straight to Wittgenstein next, but logical positivism is the notion that mostly it's in some ways it could be seen as a reaction against this kind of thinking. All of the German idealism and theology, it's just like this is balderdash. We're just going to throw all this out and we're going to limit ourselves to stuff we can be sure is true. And so we have something called the verification principle, which is that you're going to have, if you want to say something is true, you have a proposition, and then the proposition has to refer to specific things and it has to be well made. And you can then determine whether it's true or not. And if you can't do that, if you can't, and this is going back to Hume really, if you can't do that, then okay, you're saying stuff that may have poetic force, but it can't be said to be true. And this actually goes all the way back to Socrates, determining the difference between truth and opinion. And so you can see the Vienna Circle and those guys as a reaction against all of this stuff, which excuse me, Wittgenstein calls language going on a holiday. And oddly enough, though, Wittgenstein was very enamored of Kierkegaard. He thought Kierkegaard was very deep. In fact, I think at one point he says he's too deep for me. And he doesn't mean that sarcastically. He means it sincerely, I believe. So
He also loved Dostoevsky.
Sorry?
He loved Dostoevsky. Wittgenstein apparently carried the brothers Karamazov with him when he was in the trenches in World War I, and knew by heart a lot of what the holy hermit Father Zosima has to say. I just found that out recently, and it surprised me.
Wittgenstein's a surprising guy. And when I took my first Wittgenstein class in at Pomona, everybody in the class, except the professor, perhaps, thought that this was nonsense. This was at best irrelevant. And we'll see if we can make the case why it isn't. I'm not sure I can make that case, but I will do my best because I think he's one of the real important guys in Western thought. So we'll call it a day here unless we have more comments, more input. This has been pretty good today. Peter's been very helpful. And anybody else? All right, then we will see you on Tuesday and we'll talk a little bit about Ludwig Wittgenstein, I think.
Thank you, Tony.
All right.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay, guys.